Welcome to this Think Ahead event from traditional to trailblazing, strategies for mid-career transition. I'm very pleased to welcome you here today. Think Ahead is London Business School's event and podcast series in which London Business School's leading faculty and guests talk about the big business issues of today. I'm Sarah Gordon. I'm currently a visiting professor in practice at the London School of Economics. I was a journalist for many years, former business editor at the Financial Times, and I'm going to be your host for this evening. So a very, very warm welcome. Now, our event title is Mid-Career Transition, but frankly, transitions in careers are something that we're going to need to think about at any age and at any stage of a career. So I hope you find lots that's going to be relevant for you, whatever stage you are in your career. And I know we've got people in the audience from all over the globe and from a whole range of different age groups and backgrounds. So transitions are something that's going to happen to a lot of us in our career, and hopefully lots to take away from the discussion with our fantastic guests today. So sometimes career transitions are forced upon us by redundancy, by changes in our industry, and sometimes they can be the most fantastic positive choice. I think it's probably fair to say that they're never very easy. Career transitions are challenging. They throw a lot of questions about ourselves, our purpose, what we want to do with our lives. But we've got people on the panel today who've had some both fantastic academic research into what can help in a transition, and also who've actually done it in real life. So before we get started with the discussion, I'd like to run a live poll to get some insights from you in the audience about your current career situation, and what that question is going to cover is whether you are currently considering a career change within the next year. You're going to be able to answer the questions using the Q&A function on Slido, which will be on the right-hand side of the screen. And the questions will be, yes, I am actively exploring a new opportunity. Maybe. I may be thinking about possibilities, but I'm not actively searching. Or no, I'm satisfied with my current career path. So hopefully those questions are coming up on the screen for you, and I'd ask you to vote. And whilst we wait for you to vote and for the results to come in, I'm going to introduce you to our fantastic panel of speakers today. First of all, Kurt Budge, who is a former chief executive and a mining executive in the mining industry, and is now a registered Forrest Yoga Teacher and an executive coach in training. Great to have you with us, Kurt. Herminia Ibarra, our second panellist, is the Charles Handy Chair in Organisational Behaviour at the London Business School. She's written a lot of fantastic books and papers on career transition and runs courses on transition planning for the London Business School. Fantastic to have you here today. And finally, our third panellist, Ross Jones, who is now an artist and a painter, but was a former captain in the British Army. So some really very diverse career experiences across our panel today. And I'm going to start by asking each of the panellists to give an introduction to themselves and their work, and also the transition that they've experienced. So if I can start with you, Kurt, please.
Yes. So Kurt Budge. I graduated from LBS 2004, and we're just about to approach our 20-year reunion, which is a bit of a shocker. I'm a member of the Alumni Council as well since last August. LBS really was supposed to be a period of transition for me. I I took my MBA to actually get out of the mining industry. But on graduation, I then went and joined Rio Tinto, one of the largest mining companies in the world. So what was clear at the time is that while I was at LBS, it was around creating possibilities. And I found myself for the next 19 years sticking in the industry in a variety of different roles. And the last role was, as you said, as CEO of a dual-listed exploration and development company for 8.5 years, 7.5 years of which I spent trying to get one mining project permitted. And when that permit finally came through, it was preceded by a family tragedy 6 weeks before. That's when my questioning around what I was doing in my career actually started. That was February 2022, March 2022. And a year later, then I exited my last role. So I've been out now from the mining industry for a year. And really, I've taken the opportunity to follow my curiosities, to explore my passions, to try a few things out. One of those was to qualify as a Forrest Yoga Teacher, to do this diploma in coaching and positive psychology, and then to take a couple of courses with LBS, the Business of Artificial Intelligence, and the career change for over 50s and beyond, which I choose not to think of my age too much because it's not a limiting factor as far as I'm concerned, but really allowing myself the freedom to really explore and again go back to what I learned 20 years ago, which was around creating possibilities. So that's where I'm at the moment.
Thank you very much, Kurt. Herminia, tell us a bit about your work.
Right. So I'm Armenia, and as a typical academic, I study and teach on things that I don't do myself. So I've never made a big career transition. I've been an academic all my life, but this is one of the topics that has fascinated me for more than 20 years now, studying how people make career transitions, what holds them back, what helps them move forward, what are the patterns at different stages, are they different, what are the similarities, and working on a new book right now, looking at later career transitions, having studied mid-career pretty deeply over the last 20 years.
Thank you. Ross, over to you.
My name's Russ Jones. I'm a conceptual artist and painter. I've been doing this for about 4 years now. I came to LBS post-military where I was a counter-terrorism and counter-poaching officer. So I travelled around the world with a small team and looked for bad guys. I came to LBS initially looking to go to consulting, looking at the luxury goods and retail arm of Boston Consulting Group. Went there and was really looking for something that looked a little bit more like my previous role, where I was in charge of a team. And it took me about a year of being at LBS and really trying to understand what the corporate world looked like and what entrepreneurship looked like. Then I went off to Berkeley for a little bit and found myself in California and snuck into a few art classes there and just fell in love with the industry. When I came back to the UK, it was me trying to figure out how to make that balance with the fact that I had an MBA and now had this love for making art and making it work. Started doing these weird conceptual projects that I knew wouldn't make any money, but thought put passion into it and experiment, and found some investors and collectors in my first year and haven't looked back since. Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, masses to explore and unpick and all of that. Thank you all very much. And before we get into the discussion, just a look at your answers to the questions. An awful lot of you are actively exploring new opportunities, which is great and probably explains why you're listening to us today. And a lot of you are still, quarter of you, a bit more than a quarter of you are open to possibilities. So hopefully our discussion will give you some more food for thought. And good. I'm very glad that 5 of you are satisfied with your career path. That's fantastic, but hopefully you'll still find something to take away from our discussion today. So I should say before we get into the discussion that I've done some big career transitions as well. Not quite perhaps as dramatic as 2 of our panellists, but I took voluntary redundancy from the Financial Times in 2019, and I have to say found Herminia's work immensely helpful and supportive in that journey. So, very much looking forward to hearing your additional insights today. So, I mean, if I can come back to you, Russ, I mean, it sounds very exciting, your transition. Did you experience it as exciting and an opportunity? How was it emotionally?
I think emotionally, anything exciting is a little bit chaotic, but definitely. I think a lot of the excitement was around finding this new world or career or way of living that I didn't think existed. And the more that you get into a new career or a new system, the more you kind of unravel how little you know. And that's where the excitement is, really knowing that there's a whole new life to have.
Did you have moments of panic?
Sure, I think I still do.
Yeah.
I don't think they ever leave.
It's a good sign
It
sometimes,
is.
having moments of panic, isn't it?
Yeah.
And Kurt, obviously you'd had this wanting to do a transition at a much earlier stage of your career, and then coming to it in 2022 with some really painful things happening to you as well as the recognition that you wanted a career transition. How was it, the transition for you? Was it, as you approached it, did you feel excited? Did you feel worried?
I think the exit is an event. So the exit from the last role, I think coming out, there was a period where it was a bit of a get out of jail.
Relief.
Being the CEO of a public company, it's not straightforward sometimes to leave, and so I definitely felt there was a get out of jail moment and a period of reflection on the 19 years period, and what that informed me was that my head had been responsible for all my career choices for 19 years, and that I'd completely ignored what my heart was saying or my gut was saying.
Gosh.
And so that was a huge moment,
Yeah.
as you can imagine. And then it was a case of getting in a few months out and thinking, okay, now, again, following my passions, yoga being one of them, but then also reconnecting with the school. The school's very important to me, and doing the alumni council, joining the alumni council, and then doing the courses, hugely important. And they, specifically Herminia's course, the career change for over 50s, that thankfully was reinforcing what I was doing naturally, which was a lot of experimentation.
It can be there can be very uncomfortable moments, though, can't there, when one's taken such a big decision? And I think certainly in my experience, learning to sit with the discomfort was actually very helpful.
Yeah, I completely agree. And the living with uncertainty, because you don't actually know what the final outcome's going to be. You're doing lots of things. You're running multiple work streams, but you don't actually know which one's going to take the front. But I think the word that I think you used or Russ used around adventure, I am treating this somewhat as an adventure, and trying to find a state of flow where I spent a long time trying to find meaning and purpose. Actually, I think if I find things that excite me and which drive me, I don't actually need to have the definition. I have found my meaning and purpose.
Well, that's a good, very interesting way of looking at it. I mean, Herminia, you've talked and taught many people who've been going through some very big career transitions. Is there a theme to some of the sort of challenges and issues that people face in career transitions? Is it possible to sort of say, there's the top 5 things that people find difficult?
Yeah, and I've been asking about that for a very long time, so I have a sense of the big patterns. So one of the big ones is when you're in a role and you know what you don't want, you're unhappy with it, it's not making your heart sing, but you don't know what you want to do instead, and so you don't know how to get started. And you've been taught not to take action until you know what you want. To start with, what are you shooting for? What's the destination? And so people feel that they just shouldn't do anything at all, that maybe I'm too confused, I'm going to make a dumb move, and they don't realize that by not doing things, like you ended up taking some art classes. You probably weren't planning on making that a career at the outset, but it's by doing things, experimenting with them, sometimes just following your heart. You're not meaning for this to be a career, that you learn new things, that you get more in touch with what you're interested in, that you get out of the kind of insular circle that keeps you where you are. So that's the first one, is thinking that you can't take a move until you've figured it out. The other one is when you have taken a move, or a move has been made for you, and you find yourself in this period that you've alluded to, where you're kind of betwixt and between. You haven't quite left the old behind, the new isn't yet fully materialized, you've lost your sense of identity as anchored in what you used to do. It still is the barometer. And so that sense of being in limbo, you don't know how to explain yourself to people, you don't quite know where you belong, it's a little bit lonely. That's when you get a bit scared. And that's when people get tempted to take the wrong job, because it comes to them, it's easy, it's what they used to do, as opposed to sitting long enough with the process to take one step after another and start to discover. So those are the two biggest ones.
And what's those both, yeah, they really resonate with me, and I could see you both nodding, doing.
Sure.
What is some of the sort of guidance and advice that you give to people to help with those two challenges, that you don't know the destination and you have to sit with the process?
So one of the things that I do that is people find enormously liberating is I ask them to make a list of possible selves. And so instead of saying, where do you want to be in 3 years' time or in 5 years' time, I say, make a list of as many and as divergent bunch of things that you can think of, and you don't really have to know that much about them. They can be completely improbable. They can be things that you actually don't want to do, but they're possibilities. Just put it all out there. And try to talk to some people about it and see what happens. And people inevitably have some things they're interested in, which they could explore by taking a course or doing some volunteer work over a weekend. Or, one of my participants said, I get interested in something, I buy a book about it. That's the first step. It costs £15, no more. It's cheap, and I can find out if I'm interested in more. So doing something. And for people who actually, and this happens a lot, who have no idea whatsoever, who have no interest that's calling out to them, I just say, well, do something extracurricular that, again, extracts you from the context that so heavily defines your sense of identity and your obligation to who you used to be, just as a way to start building some new relationships, to start experiencing yourself in a different way. So
I love that idea, that trigon of different selves. See how they fit, see whether you feel comfortable in them, excited about them. I love that idea.
And a huge part of that is it gets you into new networks, because your old networks only reinforce who you used to be. They expect you to be in that way. They don't think you're likely to be a good artist or entrepreneur. They think it's kind of funny. They can't see you that way. So it's really liberating to find yourself in circles where what you're thinking about is actually completely normal, and why not?
Yeah, and that I like the dipping your toe in as well.
Yeah.
Read a book, have a conversation.
It's definitely a dip your toe.
You don't have to go 100% immediately.
Because often people find that the thing they thought they wanted to do, they actually don't like it as much, or don't want to do it full time,
So
or don't want to do it for a living.
To back out.
Yeah. Non-commitment.
Yeah, non-commitment. It also can be as good as commitment. I know that a lot of that will resonate with you, Kurt, but in terms of what sort of helped during your transition, in terms of the sort of support networks that you were able to access, was that important? Was that an important part of the transition?
Yes, specifically doing the Herminia's course at LBS and being within a small group of people who were going through similar experiences, that was your support network. And then getting comfortable with these concepts around, going through the exercise of possible selves and thinking more broadly, and then pushing that out and thinking, well, who do I need to speak to? How can I explore this? What are the gaps between where I am and where I would like to get to understand if this is a real possibility? These were all really new concepts for somebody that considers that careers are quite linear.
Yeah.
And you just go down a path, and from graduate school to retirement, and so it was all really refreshing and helpful to be thinking about this, and also to the reinforcement that my period of experimentation that I'd sort of stumbled on across was actually really what I should be doing, to test out different ideas.
And I think particularly on that mid-career transition point, I mean, we're a range of ages in the room, but we're none of us, your traditional undergraduate age. And I think maybe that non-linear career path is perhaps more familiar to younger people nowadays. But I think certainly when I left the FT, in my 50s, the idea that you could actually branch off into lots of different and new directions felt really quite revolutionary.
Yeah, parents and in-laws expect you to be finding another job straight away.
In the same thing.
Yeah, in the same thing. And when you say, oh no, I'm studying to become a yoga teacher, they automatically, you go from CEO of a public company to a yoga teacher. Hang on a sec, there's something not quite right there.
Can't compute.
Yeah, and so having that conversation, and also having the conversation with my nearest and dearest, and being given the time. I think one of the points we were talking about earlier was actually gifting yourself the time to be able to have this period where you do get it out of your system, because otherwise, if you do end up falling back into the same role too quickly, I feel that there's wasted potential.
Yeah. And what about you, Russ? What support networks, or what support sort of the things that helped you through the transition? What was most important to you?
Sure. Much the same as what Kurt said, in that I would say, hey, I'm an artist now, make this big announcement. People go, okay, well, Russ has lost his mind a little bit. Maybe I need to help him. But I found a lot of the negative voices and the biases that I expected were more from myself. And it was confidence in what I was doing. And the more time I spent actually doing the thing and becoming knowledgeable and a more valid contributor to that industry, the less those voices existed.
Yeah.
And I remember I had my first show in London. I invited all of my LBS classmates to it. They were in town. And it was this wonderful, heartwarming moment, because up until that point, I thought everyone's going to turn up and laugh at me. But I know my art's good. And when they came in, it was just nothing but positivity. So when you do finally make that transition, people do want to see the best in you, and they want to see the new version of you and what you're growing to.
And what about your army friends? Did they come to your exhibition?
Yeah.
What do they think of the new you?
They're very, very positive. So one of the things that I had there was some military ordnance that was brought over from the Ukrainian war, and they helped me bring that over from Ukraine through this and through the army supply chain. So yeah, I'm still super reliant on the military, and they're very, very supportive of anything. They're wild.
And I think that's quite an important point as well, that even when you make what look like very radical shifts, there is still threads and connections with your former career and your former self, aren't there? You don't lose that connection.
No, not at all. And I think one of the cool things that I've seen, especially with art, and I assume it's with everything, is when people come to an industry with experience from elsewhere, they do bring skills with that, just as you would expect it with a new employee in a company. And having that come in to art, which is generally considered not very capitalist in nature, not very testosterone or operationally reliant, it's quite nice to come in and say, hey, like, let's do things in this way, and maybe we can either be more capitalist in our way of making money and improve the business side of things.
So you're bringing a different perspective to to your new world.
Yeah. And people value you for it.
I bet. And Herminia, if we come back to how you, when you're thinking about, and a load of our audience are in the process of thinking they may be going to do a big transition. Can you give us a sense of what you think people should be thinking about in terms of how you prepare? Should you have a plan A, a plan B? Should you give yourself, how much time should you give yourself to prepare? I mean, I think some tips would be really helpful for our audience.
Yeah, so planning doesn't always work, right? So where it really is helpful is in terms of some financial planning, particularly if you want to have a year off or some time off to really discover. It's good to have set some money aside, or it's good to look at the spending levels, or what is it that's really tying you down, because often, not always, but often you do take a financial hit at the outset, and so planning for that is good. Other than that, it's and also kind of planning in terms of time. If you want to take a year off and take a course or have some sort of sabbatical, that also requires planning. But there is a lot that you can't plan, in that it is putting one foot in front of the other and allowing yourself to discover and find things that you weren't expecting, find that you don't so much enjoy some of the things you thought you might, bumping into some new things, kind of following your nose as you do something, meet a person, get another contact, dip your foot into another world. And so there's a very iterative aspect of it that is hard to plan ahead for.
And I think that idea that it has to be quite an open-ended process is really important, isn't it? I mean, I know one of the things that a lot of people said to me is, use your network, go and talk to lots of people, have lots of conversations. But the very nature of those conversations is that they then say, oh, you must go and talk to someone else who's really interesting. And, you have to allow that open-ended process to develop naturally, I think, don't you?
Yeah, now there's a limit too. I mean, some people get fed up with that at some point, or some people feel like, okay, now I've got to get a real job because it's time. But there's also a danger of cutting that off prematurely without having given yourself the time to know yourself in a different way outside of that identity that's so defined by what you used to do. So it's really hard to describe this aspect of it, because I always contrast what I call the plan and implement model of career change with the experiment and learn model of career change. Plan and implement you can do when you know where it's going and it's somewhat linear, and you can get help from headhunters or recruiters, and you're going into a fairly established thing. You can do that. Once you're making a kind of a nonlinear move, when the marketplace is more difficult to identify, so for example, even people who want to remain in the management and leadership space, they're often turning to smaller and medium-sized enterprise, or you're trying to become an entrepreneur. When it's more unstructured, you've got to experiment and learn and take a more iterative approach.
Do you have students who decide actually a career transition is not, after all, the right thing
Yes,
to do?
absolutely, absolutely. Just now, actually, I just interviewed somebody who was part of the course who was quite eager to get out and as quickly as possible, and really was facing lots of different constraints, geographical, aging parents, all the stuff that real life is made of. And she eventually realized that she could do some things to tweak what she was doing that would buy her more time, so she wasn't having to act in haste, and she was able to take care of some of these contingencies. So sometimes when you go through the process, you realize I'm actually better off staying where I am, or at least for now, but you've gone through the process.
Yeah, and maybe making, as you've described, making a few shifts or tweaks that make your current situation more fulfilling.
Yeah.
I mean, Kurt, Russ has talked about some of the negative voices and the prejudices coming from within him rather than from outside. But I mean, you came from an incredibly traditional industry. I mean, public and in the mining industry, but also a publicly listed company. I mean, it's And you've gone into an area which is, I mean, it's more traditional than it used to be, but it's still not as traditional a career choice. Have you met with biases or prejudices from people, and has that been difficult?
I haven't, but I think it'd be challenging to actually explain if I was going to make such a switch. But to Herminia's point, it may well be that one of the possibilities that I end up back in the industry that I've always been in, but I go in a much healthier state than when I finished last May, because I've got things out of my system. But I could see I would choose not to hang around people that had biases, being brutally honest, because they're not going to serve me going forward. I think that it is challenging, the uncomfortability about, because people will ask you, well, what's your plan? As soon as you've left the last role, what's your plan? And, these are important stakeholders in your life. And if you're saying, well, actually, I don't have a plan at the moment, and for a period of time, and that's really challenging for yourself as well. So when you start to talk about negative voices, the Kurt's asking himself, okay, what's your plan, Kurt? We've been out now because the clock is ticking. 3 months go by, okay, you needed a break. Then 6 months go by, then 9, and then you're thinking, well, crikey, it's going to be a year soon. And then you've got all these thoughts around, well, people always say you've got to get back and work soon, or else people will forget about you.
Are there people saying that to you?
Of course. You won't be able to get back into the workforce.
You've got to be in the mix, and so it's a really challenging period. It doesn't really matter about the biases going out there. It's what's going on inside of here sometimes, and I think again, you need the period of reflection. I dropped a lot of bags that I've been carrying, as I would say, that I'd accumulated in my last role and my career, more and more weight coming onto me in my backpack, so to speak. And when I exited the last role, the period of reflection, I start dropping all this stuff. I start reevaluating events, putting more positive meaning to them. It's been a very healthy process to go through.
And you started with the idea that you were provisionally going to aim for a year, or had you decided a time period, or?
No, I thought a year was, when it was suggested to me, I thought, no, this is going to be 6 months. And then, so I went May to September, but then I had all these courses I started signing up for.
With Herminia.
Herminia started in November, I think it was. October, I started the Business of Artificial Intelligence. And in the same month, I started the Diploma in Coaching and Positive Psychology. So actually, there was a period of time where I was busier not working than I had, it was as busy, but it was really, really fulfilling.
I mean, quite a lot of people said to me, you need to give a big career transition at least a year. And I was saying to my panellists before we started that I was in a job, I think, within a month. So I'm feeling a bit like my time period perhaps wasn't long enough. But Herminia, do you advise people to give themselves a particular time period, or do you leave that open-ended as well?
There's a lot of different circumstances. When you really are coming out of a job you've been in for a very long time, in a career you've been in for a very long time, and you're thinking you might want to do something different, and you've got the means to be able to take some time off, it's really helpful, because what people always find is that the knee-jerk is, as soon as you find yourself in this limbo state, to want to fill up the time, to feel a little anxious about it, and inevitably what is going to come to you right away is very similar to what you were doing before. And so it's not necessarily going to scratch your itch for something else. So that's really the logic of it.
How long did your transition take?
I think it's always ongoing. When I look at projects we're 4 years in now, and I would say some of the projects that I take on now, I drift towards things that are similar to what I would have done 2 or 3 years ago. Like I'll take on some of the more commercial work that looks like that, and I'll get a little bit stuck in it. And it takes quite a lot of effort to say, no, this isn't what I wanted. I want to kind of go towards this area of exploration, but you always want to drift back to your old self and figuring out that balance point.
Yeah, and you have to be in it to realize you've gone too far one way or the other, and then you can reel it back in.
Yeah.
I want to clarify something though, because this point about giving it a year or how long does it take makes people very nervous. This doesn't necessarily mean you're spending a year or 2 years without making any money at all. You know, it's what often people mean is you're not going to take on a huge commitment that it's going to be hard to back out of right away. So a lot of times people are advised to do projects, to do consulting, to do things on a more time-limited scale while they're still exploring and kind of getting over the old stuff.
And that's a step or several steps beyond the buying the book, dipping your toe in.
Yeah.
It's another way of trying on those different selves for size.
Yeah.
I love the year as a metric, because if you buy the book on day one and you start reading the book, if you finish the book, great, you've probably made it a few weeks. If you're still buying books after a year and you want more and more, you know you're going in the right direction. So it's less like, okay, in a year's time, I'm going to see if this worked or not. But if you say, hey, I want to work in coffee now, if a year down the line of you being involved in coffee, you're still loving it, then you've made progress towards that and it will just naturally flourish.
Yeah. Because there's two different instances here. One is, and that's the case you're describing, is you're kind of evolving towards something and you're networking into it and figuring out more this way, more that way. That takes more than a year. You know, a year is nothing in terms of figuring it out and finding your way into those circles and being part of that community and doing the work and getting better at it. A year is nothing. The other year is, are you going to accept a job that comes to you? That's a different thing. And there the caution is just be careful about taking something too soon when you're still maybe either bruised from a layoff or just coming out of a role in which you've had no time to think. So give yourself a little time to decompress and to rediscover who you are. But they're two very different kinds of situations.
And I think that is quite important as well, that sometimes, you know, you've described the burdensome backpack of being a CEO, and it does take time to recover as well from those experiences, doesn't it? That you're not necessarily the self that's the most, you know, making the most of opportunities. You need to give yourself some space to recover from the last job you did.
Yeah, and to use the word that Herminia uses, decompress. Very much, you know, coming up for air. And that's where giving yourself time, if you've got the financial freedom to do it, is again, I see it as a very healthy gift to yourself to do that work.
But I'd also like to pick up on something that you said, Russ, about sort of going into the art gallery, or, you know, there's a certain randomness as well to your description of your transition, which I really like, because I think it reflects the fact that, you know, many career choices are seizing opportunities as well, isn't it? It isn't, you know, yes, it's difficult to plan, as Herminia has said, you know, plans often go wrong, but it's also that you simply don't know what opportunities are going to come along, and making the most of those opportunities. I think for our audience, one of the often the challenge, I think, of being, for example, in your 20s is that you think you have to have a plan for the rest of your life. And in fact, so much of life is just opportunism, don't you think?
Sure. I think the serendipity of it all is something that you should really embrace. And I think where you position yourself in that journey will dictate how much serendipity happens. So I made the decision, hey, I want to go do art, and I went to art classes, and then when I came back to the UK, I started doing street installations, and I just met more people that could help me. And because I had already made the decision that that's kind of where I'm going, when someone said, hey, I'm involved with this gallery, or we do these sort of things, I knew that that was enough of a signal to say, hey, I need to maybe build a bridge to this person and learn more about them and see if this is someone I want to be closer to than my current network.
And from your sort of, the group of people you know, and perhaps the people that you were in the army with, how unusual is your experience? I mean, are lots of other of your friends, colleagues making big transitions, or is your experience really quite unusual still?
I think industry specific, it's very novel. But if I look at my peer group that have really stayed with me, they've all been involved in something similar, which is really starting a company or taking on a fund or something like that. A lot of those people are going through something very similar. I think when we look at starting a business, it's a very similar thing to a career change. You have to manage your finances for the first year. You're probably not going to make any money for 2. This might all go completely wrong. The idea might not be validated. You might be living in the clouds. But it's a really similar experience to those people, and whether it's art or technology or a real estate fund, it's all the same game. I'm really just trying to build something new that I think has value. And I think if this thing goes well, I'll be happy internally and maybe put food on the table.
I ran a startup for a couple of years, and it's the single professional experience that was the most rewarding and also the most terrifying. I definitely lost the most sleep, but it was so rewarding as well. It's
a life-changing experience for sure.
And what about you? How unusual are you?
How unusual am I?
Yeah, in terms of your transition, have people in your former mining industry colleagues, are they?
I think
surprised, bemused.
Two things. 2018 was probably the year when things really started to change for me, and just prior to that, when I started practicing yoga. So, but yoga and taking a break from alcohol, those two things in the mining industry aren't that common. So, and then if I start talking to, because to Russ's point, serendipity. Awareness, if you've got awareness of what's going on in your world, outside your world, then you start to see opportunities and possibilities. And so that for me, I've gained over the last few years great awareness. And so therefore, when I was in role, I was able to see, actually, you know what? This isn't really working for me anymore. And I need to take a break. But some of the conversations, I guess, I spooked my board when I was talking about Forrest Yoga and not drinking and spiritual practice. But, I think, again, if I was to end up back in the same industry, I go in with a whole new set of perspectives, which, and in a much healthier state, which enables me to both do work that is similar to what I was doing before, but for my own fulfillment, I'm doing it in a very different way.
Yeah, and that sense of purpose is just so important, isn't it? I mean, my experience mirrors yours and Russ's, that there aren't very many people who've been at the FT for 20 years and then leave, and it's the mid-career transitions I sense are still relatively unusual rather than becoming the norm. And we talk a lot about the changing nature of work and the fact that these big career disruptions are going to happen more. But what's your view, Herminia? Do you see it becoming? Is it becoming much more common?
Definitely.
Is it going to be the future of work, do you think?
Definitely. Just look at recently the number of mass layoffs that have happened in the business world. And so, those are forced transitions, but they're happening. And once that's happened once to a person, you realize that you're not going to stay forever in one thing, and you think about what you're doing very, very differently. We're going to have more disruption due to AI. We have lots of people who burn out and who feel that they are not getting what they want out of their work. So I see that a lot. I teach the Sloans at London Business School. They're all there as part of making a big career change. You've seen your cohort. They're all you know, people come out of London Business School or business school, they do something, and in short order, they want to create something of their own, or they want to do something else. We're living much longer, and nobody wants to do the same thing forever. Employers are not always as adaptable as they should be if they want to keep some of the best talent.
In what sense? Just give us a bit more colour on that.
Oh, in the sense of allowing people more flexibility, in the sense of being able to take a sabbatical if you need one, in the sense of not having people chained to their email 24/7, you know, in terms of allowing people to thrive and flourish.
That would be a fantastic another podcast, what employers need to do to stop people doing a mid-career transition. But I sense, Herminia, from what you're saying, that you're a fan of career transition. I mean, you think the idea of a work life where there are more of these transitions, you think that's a good thing? Can you see any downsides?
I think it's a great thing if you're able to follow your interests and grow and develop in new ways and do things that you enjoy more. It can be very disruptive as well, particularly when it's foisted upon you and you have a labor market that doesn't value your expertise, or we still have a fairly ageist labor market, and I've seen people struggle with that a lot. And so there is an aspect of that flux and flexibility that can be very challenging for people. But I do think it's a great thing to be able to flex and morph, and we as people, we're multifaceted, and to be able to express those aspects. Just because you are interested in business doesn't mean you don't have an artistic side, for example. And so what these changes allow us to do is to express all the variety in us, maybe not always at the same time. So in that sense, I think it's a great thing.
Yeah, well, I'd certainly agree. And of course, the three of us in the room who have had this career transition, we were lucky enough to choose them. So, and that's a very great privilege as well, isn't it? It's a nice segue into questions from our audience, which are flooding in thick and fast. And I'm rather meanly going to start with the one for you, Herminia, which says, "Why haven't you changed career?"
That's very funny.
Yeah.
Why haven't I?
And why you're so curious about others changing careers. It's part of the same question.
You know, the funny thing is, this stuff about career change is something that I stumbled upon. I wasn't seeking to study it. It was, I had been studying how people step up into next level roles, bigger leadership roles within a career path. And I had especially looked at people in professional services on the route to making partner or MD or what have you. And it came to a time in which the people I was following were no longer moving up, they were all moving out. And I actually started getting intrigued with all of this during the dot-com boom, when people were massively looking at entrepreneurial opportunities for the first time, and then massively looking for something else once they went bust. And I never looked back, in the sense that I found that so incredibly interesting, but I fell upon it. Now, why don't I want to change careers? I think academia is such a great job.
Yeah.
And, when I was younger, people used to say to me, don't you want to, just go out and run something, and now, you know, when they're my age, they just look at me with envy and say, how can I get to teach?
Yeah.
But we do have the freedom and the flexibility to reinvent ourselves in terms of the research we do and the teaching we do. There's no better way to learn a topic than to have to teach it. And so, so I feel very lucky to have chosen this occupation.
And the huge range of interesting people that one meets. I mean, that's what I'm finding at the LSE, is that's so stimulating, isn't it?
Yeah.
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 Thank you. Sorry, starting with a personal question, but I'll ask you two then the another really interesting question, which is that if you were to do it again, go 4 years back and start your transition again, are there things that you would have done differently? Any different approaches, different direction, and if so, what?
Yeah, definitely. I ran in as aggressively as I could. I was like, great, I'm in. And I think taking a little bit of time to really understand where you're going and set yourself up financially will just reduce a lot of the stress. And I think as part of that, it's understanding the expectations of the roles that you're going into. You know, if you're going to transition industry or role or function, what's going to happen to your home life? What's going to happen to your personal life? Is everything in order there, or is stuff going to start falling down? Because it is going to happen, and you're not going to change the industry, especially when you arrive. You're going to kind of fit in at a much lower point.
But it's a very natural thing to do, to run into it, though, isn't it? Because some of the anxiety also that we were all talking about. I mean, do you have any practical tips for how you don't run into it?
I think the way that a lot of people, or how I looked at the transition, is that there's a jump. And I think you want to delay that jump as late as possible and assume that you're wrong. Treat it like a hypothesis. Oh, I might want to enter the coffee industry. How do I disprove that as fast as possible? Maybe I'm going to go become a barista, because that's going to suck. And maybe in 2 weeks of being a barista on a Saturday, you realise that you don't like the smell of coffee when you're around it all the time. Try and sort of prove yourself wrong and do it that way. I had my proving myself wrong phase about a year in, and I was okay by that point, but it was a bit late to be doing it.
Completely agree. You know, that's the whole point of experimenting with small steps at first, and then if you like it, you take a slightly bigger step. But I think if you can, waiting in slowly is better.
And in terms of that, if I come to you with that same question, what would you do differently? But can I also ask you, pick up that point that Ross made around your home life and your family life? Do you have tips for how you help the people closest to you help you in your transition?
I'm not the best communicator, so no, is the honest answer.
Maybe that's then
I think
yeah.
the definitely on that front is communicate, over communicate what you're thinking, what you're doing. So there's some evidence of action, but things that I would consider would be, don't underestimate the amount of work you need to do if you want to make a really fulfilling transition. So everything that I've learned from Herminia's course and working identity it's part of what I do now and going forward. So really I completed the course, and the course was over a bit too quickly. So some of the practical things around networking with weaker ties, having conversations, going back to what we were talking about, awareness of possibilities and opportunities, and the serendipity that will flow from that, new connections. So this has become now part of what I'm going to do going forward. But because I haven't made a full transition in terms of what people might say, well, you left the mining industry, you're going back into the mining industry. That's not a transition, but actually the person I am is the transition. And so, but really to get the real benefit, don't underestimate the work, and the conversations are massively important. Don't sit at home. The other one is don't stay in here, get out there is the one thing that I keep telling myself over and over again. You just got to get out there, get started, do something, experiment, learn.
But I think that point you make about you do also have to put in the work.
Yes.
You have to, and I think that picks up on something you were saying earlier, that you need to really properly investigate and commit to fully explore whether the choice is the right one for you. And I think that segues nicely into a question that someone in the audience has raised about, which is not the three of ours experience, but how. So I'm going to put it to you, Herminia. When you have an involuntary transition, as you described, for example, in all those people who lost their jobs in the dot-com bust, there's a lot of pain, and it can be extremely. I mean, my father was made redundant twice in the 1970s. You know, I've witnessed at first hand how enormously painful that can be, and how much it affects people's sense of identity. And the question is, how do you, if you've had an involuntary exit, how do you maintain positive energy and momentum?
That's a great question, because it's a huge blow. I think getting involved in something that reinforces maybe a different valued identity, something that you're interested in, maybe even something at the level of a hobby, but that has you in touch with other people, that doesn't have you just kind of spinning the wheels in your head, is very, very positive. Taking a course or doing something that makes you have a sense of mastery, something that you do quite well, giving a course maybe. Sometimes not jumping into the job search immediately because your pride is wounded, and so, you know, take a holiday, do something that makes you feel good. But the other thing is being able to talk about it with other people. And the question is where you find them, because there's such a sense of shame about being laid off. And then people put off on the networking, because what do you say? And they kind of beat around the bush, and they don't connect to people. And it's really in having those conversations that you realize that it happens more often than you think, and to more people than you think. And you move on and you do something else, and it can be actually a big gift if it helps you get on track to something that you'd prefer to do instead. So it's similar advice in that get out there and do some things that are going to feel rewarding, and reactivate the network.
Yeah, and also, as you're saying, you know, allow yourself time to recover.
Yeah.
Yeah, be kind to yourself. There's a question about whether you recommend side hustles as a way to further explore transition interest. And I think that picks up on something that all of you have said, and particularly you, Herminia, around the trying different things on. I think, would you all recommend side hustles?
I would, for sure. For sure.
Why?
I think if you're in a career or function where you can't slowly move towards what you want to do, and you've got an idea that you want to explore, not having the pressure of it being your source of income straight away, and you having to actually turn it into a P&L, it's just a great acid test. You're either going to love it or hate it, and if you can't fit it into the time around your work, then you're probably not going to be able to jump into it full time straight away.
Yeah, I completely agree. Now, the thing is, some people's work is so consuming that they really can't, either in terms of actual time or in terms of bandwidth. You know, they're just exhausted, and that's more challenging. But it is the best way to explore a new path.
Yes, and I think that leads on nicely to another question from our audience, which is, how can you, in your transition, how do you identify that you're on the right track? Which I think is a really nice question. You know, what are the signs that you're? I mean, you had a good one, which is, if you're still buying the books at the end of the year, keep on buying the books. But how do you know the opposite? Is there like a light bulb moment when you realise you've hit the? I mean, you had a light bulb.
I have little metrics all the way through. It's something that I think about a lot because of such an aggressive transit. I didn't know art in itself is a difficult place to make a career. So I had to really know, am I going to survive this route? But understanding what you really want from the transition is really important. And most of the time you can quantify that. You know, am I looking for inner happiness? Am I looking for free time? Am I looking for work-life balance? Am I looking to make more money? And just having a very pragmatic way of assessing that, 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, lets you know if you're making progress towards it.
That's such helpful practical advice. Do you? I mean, you're at a slightly different stage, aren't you, than Russ? But have you had moments, or sort of? I mean, they don't have to be light bulb moments, but indications that you're on the right track.
I just touch on quickly what Russ said. Knowing what your outcomes are, what you really want. I think that's something that I've been figuring out, and then also measuring, being able to measure if you can do. So I think I would carve my year up in terms of the studies. And once the study period came to an end, that's when, okay, now this is starting to get real, because, you know, wife's looking at me saying, okay, study's done now. What's going to happen next? And definitely there was a period of time where it was sign up for another course. Not doing that, but yeah, it's very much a case of now I working towards an outcome that I really want. And I was explaining the other day around, you know, really trying to create an opportunity that is shaped to me, rather than me being a round peg in a round hole for somebody else's organisation.
Yeah.
So that takes some effort, and that takes some work.
And you described earlier very clearly the fact that your career choices had been made only with your head, and that you now want them to be with your, well, I don't know if it's just your heart or your heart and your head.
Gut is a big one. Yeah.
Yeah.
The gut is quite intelligent, and it's amazing how, me specifically, I managed to ignore it for many, many years.
Oh yeah, yeah, that resonates.
I want to say something here, though, because sometimes you are in that messy period of confusion, that messy middle part, and it's hard to quantify those outcomes, and it's hard to articulate what you really want. You still know what you didn't want, but it's still hard to articulate, and so people do ask themselves, how do I get a sense of progress? And there's this idea of small wins, you know, small things that make you feel like, okay, maybe this has promise, maybe I'm on the right track. And, you know, sometimes it's being able to realize in the course of interviewing that this role really is not for me, and I can say no. For example, I don't have to jump on it. Or sometimes it is feeling the reward of starting to become more connected into a set of people or a community that you're really interested in being part of, and you feel that sense of, I want to be a part of this. Or, you know, smaller things that give you a glimpse without you being crystal clear on what are my metrics and what do I want to achieve is really important too.
But I do think the concept of small wins, but also of metrics, also, as you said, you know, knowing what outcomes where you're wanting to get to, without it being a plan specifically, but knowing what outcome you want, all very helpful tips. And Herminia, there's a sort of follow-on question here, which is, can you please tell us about people who got stuck in their transitions for years, never getting to the end of it? Where did they go wrong?
I mean, honestly, the only examples that I can really think of getting stuck and never getting to the end are people who never do anything to begin with. And I discovered recently, thanks to my PhD student, that there's a whole area of academic study called career inaction, and it's a vicious cycle. You want to make a move, but you don't do anything. So it's inaction, prolonged over time, which produces self-blame. I lack courage. I have the wrong mindset. It's me, which then erodes confidence, which then prevents action, and you're kind of... So that's honestly the worst that I have seen. Now, I have seen people be unlucky and seem to be doing all the right things and always ending up being the number 2 finalist for the role. I've seen that happen, and I don't see a ton of it, but it can take a while, and sometimes you do have to create a plan B. But the worst of it all is not doing anything at all.
Yeah, and in fact, there's a question that relates to that here. Sometimes you're in a good job, but you don't have many opportunities to grow. How can we mitigate the fear? Stay or leave? Maybe I'll throw that out to you.
Fear is an interesting one. understanding exactly what you're afraid of, and really exploring that. I think, there've been many times during my career that I can really feel for the person that's asking the question. But I think when you stay where you are, then it goes back to this aspect around untapped potential. There's something that you're not giving to the world, and Herminia was talking about, I don't believe our careers are one thing anymore. I don't believe our lives are one thing, and again, that's something that I'm trying to build into my career, because we're multifaceted. So, and if you're sitting there frustrated, even though it's a well-paying job, you're missing out on what life's really about: experiences and connections and making a contribution.
Yeah.
Fulfillment.
There is an alternative, and I've seen people do it. You have a really good job, it plays well, you do it well, you're comfortable, you don't have to devote buckets of time to it because you do it well, and then that allows you to have a whole extracurricular life that is very, very rich. I knew somebody, for example, who was a money manager, and he had it down pat, and he didn't have to spend a lot of time on it, and he developed this whole other set of activities as an artist, first as an art lover, then as an artist, and that was he didn't expect to get paid for that much, but it was what he loved, and he had the time to do it.
Yeah.
And so he was happy with the package overall.
It's a version of a side hustle, isn't it? But
yeah.
without the huge transition. Now we're coming into our last minutes of this incredibly rich and interesting discussion, and you've given loads of practical tips to our audience, which is wonderful. But I think we really want them to go away with. I think, Kurt, it was your suggestion that what are you going to do in the next 2 to 3 weeks that's really going to get your career transition thinking going. And I'd love to hear your 1 or 2 sort of top tips for, okay, this is what you can actually do once you've stopped listening to this event. You can go away and put some things into action.
One of the first exercises we did on the course was around the possible selves. So figure out some alternative versions of yourself, things that might interest you, and then find ways that you can learn more about those areas. Either speak to people, or buy a book, find a course.
Buy that 15
Yeah, so
book.
it's very much, and how then you can start to build that in as you move forward.
Yep. So trying on those new selves, dipping your toe into those new selves. What about you, Herminia? Top 1 or 2 practices.
Very, very similar. You put it very well, Kurt. Don't stay inside your head. Go out and do something. A small experiment, a project, a thing you sign up for, 2 or 3 people you contact that you've lost touch with. But do something and have confidence that that'll lead to a next step, and keep going.
Russ?
Yeah, for sure. I echo the same thing, which is contribute in some way. Find some way to build on things, and whether that's a project or content or a blog, but actually try and create something that shows that you want to do it. And I think that goes a long way to prevent the voice in your head that tells you you can't do this. And that's your main enemy, I think, with any transition. So you've got to remember that you're the main character and this is your life. And people will say, hey, no, you can't do that, but you can.
Thank you. That's enormously helpful. And I've taken away a lot of practical suggestions from this discussion, but those 3 summary points were really important. But I also think the not being too wedded to a plan. Plans can go wrong. I loved your sort of experiment rather than plan, implement approach. I think the sort of open-endedness of the process, which I think you've all described in different ways, and also maybe picking up on something that we've touched on throughout the discussion, which is around the importance of support and communicating, having those conversations both with your professional network, but as importantly with the people at home so that they can support you. So and I'm very grateful for those insights. Thank you very much indeed. And thank you very much to our audience for joining us today. Couple of things before we wrap up. There will be a feedback survey which will come onto your screen, and we'd be very grateful if you could complete that. Will help us do even better for future events. And also to let you know about the Think Ahead podcast and event series, which is on the London Business School channel, where you can see past podcasts, past events, and also see what's coming up in the future. And the podcasts are available on all the major podcast channels as well. So all that it remains for me to do is to say a big thank you to our panellists today, to Kurt, to Herminia, to Ross. Thank you all very much indeed. Very good luck with the next stage of the transition. Thank you to you, our audience, for joining us today, and goodbye.